Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome back to Jane Austen July. And today we have a bit of a different video for you because today I am joined by the wonderful Jessica Bull, the author of Miss Austen Investigates, and we're going to be talking about Jane Austen retellings. So before we get started, just for anyone who is new to this channel, hi, my name's Katie Lumsden. I like books a lot. I am an editor, I'm a booktuber, and I'm also an author. My debut novel, The Secrets of Hartwood, came out last year, and my second novel, The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hearst, is coming out imminently, / maybe up by the time this video goes up, depending on scheduling. And today I'm joined by Jessica Bull. So Jess, to get us started, do you want to introduce yourself and your novel?
Yes, so I'm Jessica Bull, I'm the author of Miss Austen Investigates. As you might expect, I'm a huge Jane Austen fan, but I'm also a really big crime fiction fan. So when I was thinking about how to tell Jane Austen's life story, I came up with the idea of setting it to a murder mystery. So Miss Austen Investigates stars a very young Jane Austen. In 1795, she's trying to enjoy a romance with a charming young lawyer, Tom Lefroy, when unfortunately the body of a milliner is found bludgeoned to death. And she wants to solve the crime, firstly because she knew and respected the milliner, and then secondly, one of her brothers, Georgie, is arrested in connection with the crime, and if she doesn't solve it, he's going to face the gallows.
And it's very, very good. I loved it so much. It was fantastic. Wonderful pick for a retelling for Jane Austen July this year if you're taking part. So before we talk about Austen retellings, let's have a chat about Jane Austen herself. So tell us about your experiences with Jane Austen. How did you first get into Jane Austen? What was the first book you read and when was that?
So it's a classic moment in 1995 when I was watching Sunday night TV with my mum and Colin Firth came on screen in the BBC's Pride and Prejudice and just lit up the screen really, and I fell in love with Jane Austen for that moment. So the costumes, the story, the humour, I loved everything about it, and I went into school the next day and asked my English teacher, why aren't we studying this? Like, you know, I was doing my A-levels at the time and I can't even remember what books we were studying, but I said, like, tell me about Jane Austen, I want to know who she is and what she wrote and everything about her. So he sent me off to the library to borrow Northanger Abbey actually, which was a really good move for an English teacher, I think, to start with that one, because I was 17 and I think Northanger Abbey is quite a YA book in a way. It's like really focuses on friendships.
It's a real coming of age, isn't it?
Yeah. And I just loved it. So I started from there really and just made my way through all of her novels and never looked back.
Yes. I find this really fun because I also got into 19th century literature through adaptations. I watched the adaptation of Jane Eyre with Ruth Wilson and Toby Stephens as a teenager and just like completely fell in love with that. I watched the first episode and then read the book like before the second episode. And I think I'd seen at least the 2005 film of Pride and Prejudice before I read the book. And that definitely like helped me get into classics as a teenager, like knowing a bit of the story and having a bit of context, but also like seeing something and wanting more of it, and so wanting to go to the books. And I think the first Jane Austen I read was Pride and Prejudice, and then Sense and Sensibility, and after that I can't remember what order I read them in. But yeah, Jane Austen as a teenager is so fun, I think, because her books are actually really accessible. Like her writing style is quite easy and fluid, and often a lot less dense than sort of later 19th century authors like Charles Dickens. And she does deal with a lot of like coming of age story. A lot of her heroines are kind of in their late teens, early 20s, and that means she's just such a fun like writer to get into when you're young.
Kind of going back to what you were saying about adaptations, I think they're really, really important in introducing new readers to classics, because I always find it really upsetting when people don't like a new version of an adaptation because they're hanging on to the old one. So I love it when I'm doing events and we often ask if you prefer the 1995 to the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. Nothing is going to start a fight between Jane Austen fans more than that question. But I always think even if the latest one isn't your favourite because you've already got one that you've given your heart to, it's really important, and we should welcome each new one, because with each new adaptation we're going to introduce a whole node of new readers to Austen or any classical authors, because I've got 2 teenage daughters. They're not going to go and watch Colin Firth in 1995, but they might stumble across the Netflix Persuasion or their Emma 2020 with Anya Taylor-Joy. And yeah, I just think it's really important to, they may not be for you because you might have your preferred one that you watched at a particular time that really impressed itself on your heart, but we should welcome each one.
But also, I think what I like about adaptations, which I guess is what I like about retellings too, is how they're just really interesting interpretations of the original text. And as someone who loves the original text, seeing how different people interpret it or take a different spin on it or how they view certain things is something I find really interesting. So I think if you look at the 2 Pride and Prejudice adaptations from 1995 and 2005, the interpretations of Mr. Darcy as a character are really different. But I find that really interesting because he is a character you can read in lots of different ways. I love the 1995 adaptation, but my interpretation of Darcy as a character is much closer to the 2005 interpretation of him as a character. And I find that really interesting because it's just fun to see different people interpreting Jane Austen in different ways.
I always think of it like, rather than comparing it to the original, you should try and look at what they're trying to say about the original, because that's somebody's interpretation, as you said, and I'm always ready to listen to people talk about what they feel about Jane Austen. So I'm always looking for what is it they're bringing to it. And Matthew McFadden just got that amazing vulnerability and awkwardness to me. The hand flex is iconic. I mean, I say that 1995 made the biggest impression on me, but I watch the 2005 all the time as well. I love it.
Yeah, and it's shorter. You can fit it into your life a bit more easily, can't you? Yeah. So what is your favourite Jane Austen novel? If you had to pick, could you pick?
No, I couldn't pick. So I think that it's normally the one that I'm reading at the time, and at the moment I'm getting ready for my second book, which has a bit of a Sense and Sensibility theme, so that's my favourite at the moment. But I think that Pride and Prejudice isn't just Jane Austen's best novel, it's the best novel ever written in the English language. So it's got character, it's got plot twists, it's got dialogue, it's got humour, it's got romance, it's got like sizzling chemistry between Elizabeth and Darcy, and I just think it's the most perfect novel. It defines what a novel should be for me. It's absolutely brilliant.
So in your novel Miss Austen Investigates, we're following Jane Austen at 19. What was it like doing research for the book and kind of immersing yourself in Jane Austen's life, I guess?
I was really struck by her life story, especially because after discovering her as a teenager, I accidentally ended up living in Hampshire for a while, very near where Jane Austen lived when she wrote her novels. So the cottage in Chawton that her brother gifted her and her sister and her mum when she was in her late 30s, when she really sat down to write. And I would go there very often, and it really made me think about how she could have written those novels, but also how her life story was presented. Because I think we're sold kind of 2 versions of Jane. One is kind of heartbroken Jane, who fell in love as a teenager, had her heart broken, and never recovered, and therefore wrote all these beautiful romance stories. And the other version is the kind of bitter old spinster Jane Austen, who's like really kind of wry and sardonic, and is kind of above romance. And I think that neither of those really represented what Jane Austen means to me. So particularly when I was trying to get the tone right for the book, the sources that impressed the most on me were the ones where I was trying to catch her at her most unguarded. So I read a lot of her juvenilia, and her juvenilia is the writings that she wrote between kind of 11 and 17, and then a lot of Lady Susan really impressed itself on me, because it's such a fantastic exploration of a really dark character. It's kind of unfinished, Lady Susan, because I think she wrote herself into a bit of a hole with this like fantastic, terrible heroine, really looking at what it means for a woman to be wicked, and then kind of couldn't recover from that. And obviously her letters as well. So you probably know that Jane Austen wrote about 3,000 letters during her lifetime, but the family destroyed most of them. So Cassandra destroyed a lot of them after she died, and then when she was coming to the end of her life as well. And probably because Jane Austen was so fantastically rude about all their friends and family in those letters, I think it's a bit like making a pact to delete all your WhatsApp messages.
Yeah, even in some of the ones we have, there are some very rude jokes. I think there's one where like a neighbour died and Jane Austen says she probably just looked at her husband and that would have killed her. And you're like, goodness, Jane, this woman just died. And there's a few things like that which are quite shocking but quite fun.
Yeah.
And you get the sense of Jane as this hilarious, witty person with this mean sense of humour, which I do really enjoy in her letters.
Yeah, so that was the Jane that I was trying to tap into, the kind of witty, joyful, outspoken, sometimes getting herself into a little bit of trouble with her sharp tongue Jane. So yeah, that was who I was trying to find and who I was trying to represent on the page. And especially, as you say, the teenage Jane Austen. I knew that this is the start of a series, and I knew that it would probably be the only time when I could write about her as a teenager, so the same age as many of her heroines, and making all the same mistakes as many of her heroines. So there's a fantastic part in Northanger Abbey where Catherine's so carried away with being herself a Gothic heroine that she accuses Mr Tilney's father, General Tilney, of murdering his wife. And it's a brilliant Jane Austen moment because it's so mortifying, because, you know, Henry then mansplains to her about how this couldn't possibly be the case because this is England and we are Christians. And she's so embarrassed, but because she's not right, but on the other hand, her instincts are right. General Tilney is a monster.
Yeah, he's not a good person.
So, yeah. So that was, she's kind of partly based on Catherine Morland, and then very much based on the letters and the Jane that just kind of rang true to me from those.
One of my favourite little things in Jane Austen is that Jane Austen decided to call two characters Jane Bennett and Jane Fairfax, both of whom are like the really sweet, nice, quiet, inoffensive people. And I feel like that's definitely an in-joke with her family. Like, I feel like it's definitely a joke because Jane was nothing like that. And if you read her letters, she was just the complete opposite of Jane Bennett, who thinks well of everyone. That wasn't Jane Austen at all, which I always find very, very entertaining. I think that's good fun. So let's turn our thoughts to Jane Austen retellings. And I feel like there's lots of different kinds of Jane Austen retellings out there. There are sort of modern retellings which take a Jane Austen story and put it in a different time, or there are kind of retellings that take place in the world of Jane Austen's books, you know, taking a minor character or a side character and looking at their lives or doing some kind of sequel. And then there are books which feature Jane Austen as a character, which are not exactly retellings but have that kind of same, like, Jane Austen metaverse feel to them. So what are some of your favourite retellings? Because Jane Austen retellings are amazing.
So I love Jane Austen retellings. I'm always going to buy them. If something's advertised as a Jane Austen retelling, it's immediately going in my shopping basket. So this was really hard, choosing a select few to share with you, but I've chosen the ones that I think made a big impact on my life and on my journey as a writer as well. So first of all, Helen Fielding, Bridget Jones's Diary. So this came out in 1996, just after the big 1995 moment. And I've heard her talk about it, and she said that when she was writing it, it was like while Pride and Prejudice was on TV. Fun. And it is very much a Pride and Prejudice retelling. And I love it because it introduced me to the idea of a Jane Austen retelling. So taking her characters, which are so beloved and so universal, and putting them in a different time, different place, different culture. And I also love it because it's so wickedly funny. So I think, like, it was pre-Me Too, it was caught up in the diet movement of the 90s and the noughties, so half of me wonders if it might have dated a little bit, but the rest of me thinks it shows how brutal it was to be a young woman in the 90s, so yeah, it's worth remembering those things. What do you think?
I read that in, I guess, 2015, 2016, that kind of time, and I do think things are dated. Like, it doesn't feel like a modern Jane Austen retelling, it feels like a 90s retelling, which it is. And I think that works, and I think there are really interesting elements in it. I definitely found the diet culture stuff, like, unnerving. And I think that is the point. Like, I think she lists, like, her weight a lot of the time, and her weight is very light, and that is the point, but also because she doesn't feel that she's skinny and she's worrying about her weight a lot, it feels quite, like, oppressive that she's like, oh, I'm this exceptionally lightweight and I don't feel like I'm healthy. And I think that means that it's quite a sort of claustrophobic read in a way. But, you know, I think that is what the 90s were like.
I heard her speak at the Women's Prize, and she said that when she was writing it, she was looking at her university diaries, where she lists all these things, like, you know, a yoghurt 100 calories, a carrot 15 calories,
gosh, yeah.
a box of milk tray 4,228 calories. And she said that what she really noticed was like how much control that she was always trying to put on herself, and how much control women had to put on themselves, and maybe that's what resonated for her with Jane Austen, was that controlled society and women having like a defined place, and that being slightly different in the 90s in, you know, the enormous pressure that women put themselves under to be thin, and still do today.
I also am going to mention a modern retelling that is very new, that I really loved, which I don't know if you've read, which is Just As You Are by Camille Kellogg, which is a queer rom-com Pride and Prejudice retelling that came out last year, maybe the year before, and it's set at this magazine, The Netherfields. The equivalent of the Bennets are 4 flatmates who all work at this magazine, but the magazine is about to go under, and then it's bought by Daria, and I've forgotten the name of the character who's Bingley, but these two women come in and take over the magazine, and they are the new owners of the magazine, and there's immediately clashes and tensions. And I thought, one, it was just such a fun Pride and Prejudice retelling, but I really loved the magazine and the sort of corporate setup, and using corporate issues as a way to take the class elements of Jane Austen that can be harder to fit into the modern day in the same way. I thought it did a really good job of like using the corporate world and people's different like position within this company as a way to look at all the kind of social tension within Pride and Prejudice. So I really recommend that one. It's really good.
Yeah, I can imagine it's the same kind of, that's one place where you still really get real hierarchies of status, isn't it? It's in the workplace. So yeah, I think that would work really well, and the stakes sound good. Okay, I'm going to look out for that one. Yeah. So my next one is Death Comes to Pemberley. So this came out in 2011, and it absolutely lit up my reading list because it's a Jane Austen inspired murder mystery. So it takes the characters from Pride and Prejudice and it looks at what life would have been like for them in a couple of years' time if they had been involved in a murder, and trying to solve the case. And I really love it for 2 reasons. One, because it introduced the idea of blending Austen and mystery to me, and especially how precarious life was in the Georgian era, so how easily it was to get caught up with the law and how difficult it would be to extract yourself from a situation in the law. And the other reason I love it is because P.D. James was at the top of her game when she wrote this. So she was a police procedural crime writer, and I think she just wrote this for pure love of Austen, which I really respect her for. And I feel like overnight she changed the status of Austen adjacent fiction into something that was taken seriously and proved there was a market for it.
So I read Death Comes to Pemberley years ago, probably 8 years ago or something, and I didn't love it, but I do wonder if I should revisit it. I think I felt that the characters didn't feel to me like the characters from Pride and Prejudice, but I also think it was one of the first Jane Austen retellings I ever read, and I feel like the more retellings you read, the less precious you become in general, like, and the more like open to different interpretations you become, I don't know. So maybe I should give it another go.
Well, this is on UK Netflix at the moment, and the adaptation is absolutely beautiful.
Maybe I should try the adaptation.
And dare I say it, I might even like it more than I like the book, because I think it's Anna Maxwell who plays Elizabeth, and she takes a more starring role in the adaptation than she does in the book in terms of using her agency to solve the mystery. So it's beautiful as well.
Maybe I should give that a watch. I did also want to mention another great Jane Austen murder mystery, which is The Murder of Mr Wickham by Claudia Gray, which takes lots of different characters from lots of different Jane Austen novels, puts them all at a big house party, and then Mr Wickham gets killed. And of course, many people might have a reason to want Mr Wickham dead, and it's excellent, excellent fun. And I thought it was really fun to bring a lot of different Austen characters in. I thought that was really nice and a bit different, and meant you get to see like interpretations of characters that you don't get to see interpretations of very often. So I really liked that, and I need to read her second book, The Late Mrs Willoughby, which I think would be really good as well.
So my next one is Longbourn by Jo Baker, which came out in 2013, and this one looks at Pride and Prejudice from the perspective of the servants, and I absolutely love it because I think one of the things that I did struggle with at first with Austen is that she represents this world of the middle classes, so just below the Bridgertons but way above the ordinary person in Georgian times. But thing is, when you read the text, that the servants are always there in Austen, and they're doing really important things, but they don't. You never see anything from their perspective. They don't have their own agency. So I thought it was a really clever idea to turn that on its head and really to dive into what life was like for those living below stairs in Pride and Prejudice. And yeah, it's just absolutely beautiful. It's long overdue a film adaptation. Where is the film of Longbourn?
I would love either a combined Pride and Prejudice Longbourn adaptation or a like double bill Pride and Prejudice adaptation, all the same actors, Longbourn adaptation afterwards. Wouldn't that be amazing?
That would be amazing.
Because I love Longbourn. I thought it was so fantastic. Such a great look at Jane Austen from a different perspective, and such a great, like, the historical detail in it is just fascinating, and all the details of their everyday work is just really, really, really good. I also, one thing I really loved about the 2020 adaptation of Emma was that they make a big deal of how present the servants are all the time, and it's really emphasised in a really clever way that really like hammers home the fact that like there were not very many private conversations. Like there's always two footmen just in the room listening.
They deserve
and it's
like Oscars for the best supporting actors.
It was so well done, that adaptation.
No
for that
lines,
element.
but you know exactly what they're thinking and feeling in every scene. It's absolutely perfect. Robert Martin was really good in that one as well. Another character with hardly any lines, but he just played it so beautifully.
It's such a great adaptation. I feel like that is how all Austen adaptations should be, because that is the role of the servants in a lot of Austen novels, and they are kind of present. I also wanted to mention another excellent Pride and Prejudice historical retelling, which I don't know if you've heard of this one already. It's not, so it's quite hard to get hold of. I think I bought this like on secondhand online ages ago, and it's quite difficult to get hold of. It's very good, and this is Unequal Affections by Laura Ormstone, and it is a Pride and Prejudice like alternate possibilities where Elizabeth accepts Mr Darcy the first time. Because it's a practical decision, and then we see how their engagement unfolds, basically. And it's just really interesting. It's just a really interesting, like, thought experiment. Because Pride and Prejudice is such of a sort of character development novel, if we didn't have that turning point in the middle, if Elizabeth doesn't reject Mr Darcy, how does that affect his character arc, and what is going to happen? How does that affect everything else that happens? And it's just really, really good. So I would definitely recommend that one as an interesting one.
So that's one of the things that I love about Pride and Prejudice, and why it's such a perfect novel, is because both Elizabeth and Darcy go on such a journey and such a character arc, and like him being refused that first proposal is so important to him learning to respect her, that that would be really fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one.
My next one is Miss Austen by Jill Hornby, and this came out in 2020, and I remember hearing an interview with Jill Hornby before it came out, and she was explaining that she was taking the real person of Cassandra, so Jane Austen's sister, and writing a story from her perspective to answer the question about what happened to her letters. And at first, I admit, I was absolutely outraged by the idea that she could take a real person and turn them into a novel. And I was so outraged, I pre-ordered the hardback to find out what it was like. And I really, really loved it. And I think that she's doing something really, really clever here, because Cassandra's often overlooked, but she was the real love story in Jane's life, really, was that relationship with Cassandra, and it's so moving and it's so beautifully portrayed in this. And it's important to me because it was the first time I thought that, oh, if she's taken Cassandra and turned her into a character for a book, does that mean that I could potentially turn Jane into a character in my writing? So yeah, it was an important step in the story of Miss Austen Investigates.
I love Miss Austen so much. I think it's such an incredible, powerful novel. Like, I cried a lot and just thought it was incredible. But I think one of the things I really love about it is that it's about Cassandra, who was just an ordinary woman. Because I feel like so often when we talk about sort of women's history and women who have written out of history, we talk about like really important, extraordinary people like Jane Austen, who were exceptionally talented and, you know, one in 1,000 million kind of people who had these amazing talents. But actually there were also a lot of very ordinary women whose lives we don't talk about so much. And so I liked in Miss Austen how it looks at, you know, the importance of the fact that Cassandra was there and helped Jane Austen in her life and was just living her ordinary life beside this extraordinary person, because that made her extraordinary too. And it's just, it's so good. It's so good. I also, while we're talking about Jill Hornby, wanted to mention Godmersham Park, which is another novel by Jill Hornby that came out afterwards, which is also fantastic. And this book is about the governess of Jane Austen's niece, which sounds very tangential, but Jane Austen and also her brother Henry feature as characters in this book, and it is very much a book about the Austen family. And I love this book for a lot of reasons. One thing I really love about both Miss Austen and Godmersham Park, and also that I love about your novel, Miss Austen Investigates, is that they are books about Jane Austen characters, but they also have a Jane Austen retelling element, or like a nod to Jane Austen thing. So we've already spoken about how you have sort of bits of Northanger Abbey in your first book. Miss Austen has a little bit of a kind of hint towards one Jane Austen novel. I'm not going to say which one because I think it could potentially spoil one element of the book. But Godmersham Park has very strong like Mansfield Park vibes in it. We have this kind of outsider to the family who her position in the family is kind of like a bit tenuous and complicated with the main governess in this, but then we also have this pair of charming siblings who turn up at the house, and I just really enjoyed in Godmersham Park how Jane Austen and Henry Austen are kind of the Crawfords, because I just think that's amazing. I just thought it was so fun, and I love Mansfield Park a lot, so it was really nice to kind of read a bit of a Mansfield Park retelling in Godmersham Park, and I just think it's fantastic.
I'm glad you said that about Mansfield Park, because I think it's a novel that doesn't get enough love. I think maybe because it requires more knowledge of the historical context to really understand it.
And it's less of a love story, and maybe that's what a lot of people are after in Jane Austen, and Mansfield Park isn't. That's not really what it's about. Yeah.
But I really love it. I think it really shows a mature side of Jane Austen. I particularly like the Portsmouth chapters and that feeling of being the outsider within society. Which leads me on to our next retelling. So this one's brand new. It's called This Motherless Land, and it's by Nikki May, and it comes out this month in July. And it's a Mansfield Park retelling, and it's so clever because in this one, Fanny Price is Funke, and she is of mixed heritage. So her mum's British and her dad is from Nigeria, and she grows up in Nigeria, but her mum dies and she's sent to live with her British family, and it's about feeling very much like the outsider and really bending over backwards and trying to fit in, and that really difficult relationship that she has with her aunt and her grandparents, but a cousin who really saves her and acts as a really good friend to her. So Liv is Nikki May's version of Edmund. As she said when I saw her talk recently, it's not the Georgian times, so there's no cousin sex in it. So they're just really good friends. So two things really. It's one of those books that shows just how universal Jane Austen's characters and the issues that and the stories that she developed are, because you can kind of retell them in a different time and a different culture, and they feel just as relevant, just as important, just as fresh. And secondly, I feel very much that anybody who's ever felt kind of outside or oppressed by the society they live in can find a home in Jane Austen. So I think the link to Nigeria and is really important in this book, and the kind of clash of cultures, and Funke trying to fit in with her family and be more British while desperately missing her home and the foods and the person that she could be there, is just really poignant and really moving. It's a really lovely book, definitely.
Oh, I'm very excited. This is shooting up my Jane Austen July TBR. I definitely need to get hold of it. It sounds amazing. So why do you like reading Jane Austen retellings? Why do we love Jane Austen retellings so much as Janeites?
I think it's like being able to talk to another Janeite about how much you love her and all the things that you find important and moving and resonating in her work. So yeah, it's a conversation, I think, with her original work, and I just love to see what has moved other people, and keeping that alive. And then also there's all the kind of Janeite humour as well, so the nods to the things that happens in her books, which never get tired and they never get old. I think it's being able to share that love of the original story, and also because the stories are so good.
Yeah, and the characters are so complex as well. Like, if you think about the amount of retellings that are just like, here's what we think this character from Pride and Prejudice did next. Like, there's so many of those stories because there
Yeah.
are so many characters, and even the characters who aren't in it a ton feel really complex and feel really rich and feel like there are gaps or ways their lives could go that we want to know about.
Yeah.
And so you can get all these various retellings kind of looking at different characters or different angles, and I think that's really fun.
Yeah.
And also, like you say, her stories do feel quite universal and timeless, or the kind of bare bones of the stories do feel like you could move them to another place and do something different with them. And I think it's just really fun as well, as someone who loves Jane Austen, that there is this great, like, Jane Austen universe of, like, all of these different books you can read that are about Jane Austen and her life, or that are retellings, or that interact with her work in one way or another. Like, it has really added to my love for Jane Austen, especially hosting Jane Austen July for the last 6-7 years. Like, reading lots and lots of Jane Austen retellings has really enriched my love for Jane Austen, because it makes me think about Jane Austen in different ways, and also because, like you said, this is massive community and kind of people talking to each other through literature and through adaptations and so on about Jane Austen, and that's just really fun. I
think she was a really generous writer, and she often alludes to other novelists in her work. So there's that brilliant passage in Northanger Abbey where she mentions so it's only a novel, it's only a Camilla or a Belinda. So she refers to the other popular novelists of her time, like Maria Edgeworth and Frances Burney. She wanted to consciously place herself in that tradition of women's writing, and it's lovely now that she spawned a whole tradition of writers who talk to each other through their works and reflect her work through them. And I think that's really good point about what you said about even her minor characters are really interesting, and we do want to know what happens to them. So I can see you've got the other Bennett sister there by Janice Hadlow, which I really enjoyed as well. So that takes on the story of what happens next to Mary Bennett. And another one that I really love is The Heiress by Molly Greeley, which looks at Anne de Burgh. So it looks about the complicated relationship that she must have had with her mother, Lady Catherine, and follows her story.
Yeah, and there's a great book called Charlotte by Helen Moffat about Charlotte Lucas. There's a great book called What Kitty Did Next by Carrie Cadley, and that's really good as well. Like, there's so many, especially for Pride and Prejudice, much more than the others, but there's just so many, like, explorations of these characters. It's just really, really fun.
The other thing, I think, is because that she died so young. We only have 6 of her novels. And I think that, like, I remember I read them kind of in order that they were written, apart from I started with Northanger Abbey. And then I think I had, like, the list of them in the back of the book, you know, when you read a book and it's by the same author. And I can remember reading Persuasion and getting to the end and thinking, I really like this author, I'm going to carry on and see what else she's written. And there was no more, and it was devastating. So I was always looking for how I could read more Austen.
Yeah. And I think that is something that I find interesting with Jane Austen, is because she didn't write that much, and her books are not that long. So I've read all of them a lot of times. Like, if I want to reread all of Dickens, it takes me 2 years, as I'm doing currently. But if I want to reread all of Jane Austen, it really doesn't. And that means I've read all of her books a lot, and I feel very, very familiar with all of her books, which is a really, like, it adds a, like, nice comfort element to reading Jane Austen, I suppose. And also, I guess the retellings have that comfort value as well. And I feel like, because in Northanger Abbey and Sense and Sensibility, like, Jane Austen is poking fun at and having fun with other novels, and interacting with other novels, using pastiche and all of these things. Like, I just feel like Jane Austen wouldn't mind that there are lots of retellings. I just feel like she wouldn't be precious about it. She would find it really fun as well.
No, definitely. When I was writing
really
Miss Austen Investigates, and I sometimes would feel like, oh no, what would Jane say? But
Jane would be fine. She wouldn't mind it.
My guiding star was that as she wrote Northanger Abbey as a kind of homage to the Gothic novels that she loved, Miss Austen Investigates is very much my homage to, my tribute to Jane Austen.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I know that, as we've mentioned, the first book in the series has a kind of Northanger Abbey element in it, and I know you're thinking of putting other kind of Jane Austen book elements into future books in the series. How did you kind of come up with that idea? Like, what sparked that?
I love retellings, and I thought for a long time about doing my own Jane Austen retelling, but I've never been very good at sticking to a structure. Like, I was never good at colouring in as a kid. Like, I wanted to go off and draw my own picture. So I eventually came up with, you know, what if it's similar but different, and if I use that the themes of a Jane Austen novel and kind of transpose them onto a different format, like a murder mystery? Does that give me the framework and the universe, but also the freedom to explore and make it my own? And because over the series, what I really want to do is tell the story of how Jane Austen came to be the witty, wise narrator of Pride and Prejudice. So how she got there from being the young teenage writer that we see in her juvenilia. So I wanted to show her character arc and think about her character arc really strongly in each of my books. And Catherine Morland made the most sense for the first one because she's probably the most naive of all Jane Austen's heroines. And then, so when I sat down to plan the next one, I was thinking, okay, so at the end of Miss Austen Investigates, she's much wiser and she's learnt a lot. And how would her story progress from there? So the next one's very Sense and Sensibility focused, and what happens in Jane's life immediately after this finishes is that Cassandra, who was meant to get married, her fiance dies at sea, and we don't have many letters from this period, probably because it was such an emotional time for Cassandra. I can imagine that, you know, her letters would have been kind of full of despair, and she therefore wouldn't have wanted the public to kind of rifle through those. So it struck me that in Sense and Sensibility, you've got two sisters, one who's Eleanor, who's trying to hold everything together, and Marianne, who's very much falling apart. And it struck me that perhaps that was the relationship between Jane and Cassandra at that time in their lives, where, you know, Jane was still trying to go ahead with her life, but Cassandra was really suffering and mourning and giving herself. There's a part in Sense and Sensibility where Eleanor describes Marianne as nourishing her grief, and I wondered if that had been spawned from Jane watching her sister suffer. So yeah, it was really thinking about the character arc and how I could follow that through in the series by comparing Jane to her own heroines and making her essentially one of her own heroines.
I think it's such a fun premise. I've heard you say before that it's a shadow novel rather than a retelling, which I think is a really fun way of thinking about it. Because I also have experimented with writing retellings quite a lot and ultimately haven't kind of gone forward with that. But like both my two books definitely have like retelling elements or like shadow elements or like homages to 19th century authors in them as a very like present thing in the book, but they're not retellings. But actually it's really fun to write in correspondence with other writers from the past, like especially, you know, if you love books from the past or books from the present, if you love to read, then it's really nice to, when you're writing, to also be like doing something with the books that you read or talking to the books that you read in some way. I think that's really fun. So the second book in the series is called
Miss Austen Investigates, A Fortune Most Fatal.
Very exciting. Sounds very, very good. And that's out next year?
Yeah, that should be out in spring next year.
Very exciting. So, moving away from retellings to different kinds of adaptations of Jane Austen. I know we've spoken a little bit already about screen adaptations of Jane Austen, but do you have a favourite film or TV adaptation?
I feel like I can't give any of them up. So I rewatch them a lot, and I rewatch the older ones and I rewatch the modern ones. So lately the ones that I've been turning to the most are Emma 2020, and I've watched the Netflix Persuasion 3 times.
So are you a fan? Because many people do hate it a lot.
I had mixed feelings about it when it first came out, but as I said, I've actually watched the first 2 again, and I've watched because I was thinking, is this criticism fair? And then I've watched the Netflix one 3 times, and I think that there is something in it, that it captures a feeling and it captures the pining, and there's some really wonderful performances in it, especially by Mia McKenna-Bruce, who plays Mary Musgrove.
Yes, she was amazing.
Yes, she was amazing. And she's the audio narrator for Miss Austen Investigates as well, which is very nice.
I think the thing I thought about the Netflix Persuasion was that I got really cross with it because I felt like it could have been really, really good, and it wasn't. And I thought the thing that I felt was that it just wasn't Anne Elliot in any way. And I felt like so many of the minor characters were done so well. And I also feel like actually there would have been the talking to the camera and the modern dialogue. I liked all that stuff. And I think if you had an Anne Elliot who was Anne Elliot in the book to everyone else, quiet and serious, but when she spoke to the camera, she was very different. I feel like that could have been really fun, and that's not what they did. So I feel like I found it very frustrating when I watched it because it was very funny, lots of great minor characters, but that wasn't Anne Elliot. And so and so I just found it frustrating. In the same way that when you watch a lot of Mansfield Park adaptations, they've changed Fanny Price into a completely different person because they looked at her and said, she's an introvert, she's boring, we won't adapt her in that way to screen. And I find that very cross as someone who definitely identifies a lot more with Fanny Price and Anne Elliot than like most other characters in Jane Austen. Whenever they adapt them to screen, they completely change those characters. Like they do that a lot because they decide that only an extroverted, very, very witty person could possibly be relatable. And I think that's a shame because Jane Austen's heroines are all very, very different.
Yeah.
And I don't know why people who make screen adaptations want everyone to be Lizzie Bennett because they're not all Elizabeth Bennet at all. Like, they're all really different, and that's part of the joy of Jane Austen, I guess. Yeah. I do love the Emma 2021, though. That is one of my favourite adaptations. Very beautiful, very well done. Love what they do with the servants. Just a really, really, really good adaptation.
And the costumes and the music and the casting is just absolutely beautiful. I'm a bit of a historical fashion nerd, so I really like the way that they really delved into the costume history with Emma 2020, and they recreated lots of museum pieces as well. Really fun. Yeah. So it's so colourful, and really beautiful. And it's the only one where I found Knightley attractive rather than
Yeah, well, because I think a lot of people at the time were like, oh, he's too young to play Knightley, and I'm like, no, he is Mr. Knightley's age, but he looks quite young for that age, which maybe makes the point. Yeah, I think that's a great adaptation. I'm also a big fan of I think it's 2008 or 2009 Sense and Sensibility miniseries. Yeah. That's a great one. I really, really love that adaptation. I feel like a lot of people love the 90s film with Sense and Sensibility, which I don't love nearly so much, but I feel like the miniseries from the 2000s was so good. I really enjoyed it.
Again, they did really well with Brandon in that one. Yeah, he was given much more of a more youthful, more kind of fanciable. I can't think of a better word. A more fanciable Knightley and a more fanciable Brandon.
Important. And also Eleanor and Marianne both feel really young, which is really important. Like it's important that they're both very young, and I feel like that is got across much more in that adaptation of Sense and Sensibility than in the one from the 90s.
And you see Eliza Williams, she's on screen, which makes it so much more shocking what Willoughby does. He's so much more of a villain.
Yeah. That was really good.
But the film that I watch, to be honest, the most often, like if I've had a bad day and I'll come home and I'll stick it on to cheer me up, is Austenland.
I've never seen Austenland. Do I need to be watching it this Jane Austen July?
Yeah, it's really good.
Okay.
It's really good. It's really silly. Jennifer Coolidge is like amazing in it. I think it speaks to the experience of the Austen mega fan.
Okay. Another modern adaptation, like retelling adaptation, is Fire Island. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that. I should watch that.
Yeah, you really need to watch that. That is fantastic. Really, really good. And actually, that's another really good modern adaptation for like doing really interesting things with class in the modern day. And it's just, it's really, really good. 5 gay men going to Fire Island. These friends are the Bennett sister equivalent characters, and it's just excellent fun. Really, really, really well done. And then finally, what are you reading this Jane Austen July?
Okay, so I have already read a modern retelling. So This Motherless Land was my modern retelling. The new piece of Jane Austen's work that I haven't read before that I'm reading is Sanditon. So I've been putting that one off, I think because I don't want to have read the last bit. Yeah.
Have you read the Watsons then?
No, actually.
Oh, that's really good as well.
Okay.
That's really good too. I mean, they're only beginnings, they're only openings, but they're really good.
What I find really interesting about Sanditon is that it's very obviously a first draft. So the writing's quite rough, and then there'll be like a flash of her voice, which just kind of takes your breath away, and it's amazing. I'm really enjoying that. As a Jane Austen contemporary, I am listening to Camilla by Frances Burney.
How is that?
Yeah, I had to listen to it because it's 37 hours long just to listen to.
That's long. Yeah.
It's okay.
So I read Evelina by her, which I quite liked, but I didn't love it. But I read Belinda by Maria Edgeworth last year, Maria Edgeworth being like one of Jane Austen's other favourite writers, and I really liked that a lot more, so I'm thinking maybe I need to try some more Maria Edgeworth.
Yeah, so I've just finished Belinda, and I loved it as well.
It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I really, really loved Castle Rackrent, which is her.
Okay, I need to read that.
Yeah, and that's really good because it's a really short novella, and it follows the fate of the same family over different generations. And it looks at Ireland and the situation there, and And yeah, it's really funny and really good and really short
Okay.
and very readable.
Okay,
It's a lot shorter than 37 hours.
Yeah, that's a long audio. Well, I think that's mostly what we were going to talk about today. I don't know, have we been talking for ages? Possibly, but that's okay.
It's been so fun.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for joining me. It's been very nice to chat about Jane Austen. And yes, I will leave more links down below to where you can get Miss Austen Investigates. In the US, it's not called Miss Austen Investigates, it's called
Miss Austen Investigates the Hapless Milliner.
Yeah,
in
so
the US.
some extra words for if you're in the US or Canada. But yes, very, very exciting. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it this Jane Austen July. And yeah, let us know down in the comments, have you read any of the retellings we were discussing today? What are your favourite Jane Austen retellings? And otherwise, thanks very much for watching. That's all for now. And I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.